A lone figure stood atop the small hill, his cloak whipping in the bitter winter wind as he gazed across what had once been the heart of his kingdom. In the distance, columns of black smoke rose from burning settlements, stark against the gray January sky. King Alfred of Wessex, just 27 years old, watched as his world crumbled before him. The Norse warriors had struck suddenly during the Christmas celebrations of 878, overrunning the royal estate at Chippenham, where Alfred and his court had gathered. Now forced to flee with only a handful of loyal men, the last independent Anglo-Saxon king in England confronted a devastating truth. His kingdom was burning, and for the first time since the Viking onslaught began, he realized the war might truly be lost. This moment of crisis would test not only Alfred's resolve, but would reshape the destiny of England itself, setting in motion events whose consequences would echo through centuries to come. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. The England that existed before the great burning of Wessex was a land in transformation, a patchwork of kingdoms gradually coalescing from the remnants of post-Roman Britain. For nearly 4 centuries since the departure of the Roman legions, waves of Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, had settled across the fertile lowlands, establishing a series of small kingdoms and pushing the native Celtic Britons westward into what would become Wales and Cornwall. By the 8th century, these numerous petty kingdoms had consolidated into the 7 major realms known collectively as the Heptarchy: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, and Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex in the south. These Anglo-Saxon kingdoms shared a common language and similar cultural traditions, yet remained fiercely independent, often warring among themselves for supremacy. Periodically, a particularly powerful ruler would emerge to claim the title of Bretwalda, overlord of Britain, exerting temporary influence over his neighbors. Religion provided another unifying force, as the pagan Anglo-Saxons gradually converted to Christianity from the late 6th century onward. Missionaries from both Rome and Ireland established monasteries and churches that became centers of learning and literacy, preserving elements of classical knowledge through the tumultuous post-Roman centuries. The landscape of Anglo-Saxon England was primarily rural, dominated by small agricultural settlements nestled among ancient forests and rolling hills. Most people lived in timber-framed, thatch-roofed houses, grouped into small villages or scattered farmsteads. They followed the rhythms of the agricultural year, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, and enduring the scarcity of winter, their lives governed by the changing seasons and the Christian calendar of feasts and fasts that marked their passage. Society was hierarchical, but not rigidly so. At the top stood the king and his noble retainers, bound by ties of loyalty and obligation. Below them were the ceorls, or free peasants who owned their own land, the gebers who farmed others' land for rent, and at the bottom, the relatively small class of slaves. Unlike the rigid feudal system that would develop after the Norman conquest, Anglo-Saxon social structures allowed for some degree of mobility, particularly through service to powerful patrons or success in warfare. The economy was predominantly agricultural, supplemented by specialized crafts and limited trade. Markets were local affairs centered on the burhs, fortified settlements that served as administrative centers, or around major monasteries and royal estates. Long-distance trade existed, but remained relatively limited, with imported luxury goods, fine textiles, wines, spices, and decorative metalwork reserved primarily for the elite. Wessex itself was positioned in the southwest of England, encompassing modern Hampshire, Dorset, Wiltshire, Somerset, and parts of Devon. Its geography offered both advantages and challenges. The fertile valleys of the Thames, Test, and Avon provided rich agricultural land, while the marshes of Somerset and the uplands of Dartmoor and Exmoor created natural defensive barriers. Originally one of the weaker Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex had grown in strength during the early 9th century under a succession of capable rulers, particularly Egbert, who briefly claimed overlordship of all England. The political structure of Wessex, like other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, balanced royal power with traditional constraints. The king ruled in consultation with the Witan, a council of noble advisors and church leaders whose consent was required for major decisions. Local governance was organized through a system of shires, each administered by an ealdorman, a noble appointed by the king, and a shire reeve or sheriff who represented royal authority. Justice was administered through a combination of written law codes and traditional folk customs, with compensation payments, vergild, for injuries and deaths carefully calculated according to social status. Christianity had deep roots in Wessex, having been introduced in the 7th century by missionaries sent from Rome. By Alfred's time, the church was fully integrated into the fabric of society, with bishops serving as royal advisors and monasteries functioning as centers of learning and record-keeping. The faith of ordinary people combined Orthodox Christian doctrine with elements of folk belief, a world inhabited by saints and angels, but also by elves and other supernatural beings lingering from the pagan past. Into this world Alfred was born in 849 in Wantage, Berkshire, the youngest of 5 sons of King Ethelwulf of Wessex and his first wife Osburh. As the 5th son, Alfred had little expectation of ever inheriting the throne. His destiny, it seemed, lay elsewhere. His early life was marked by significant journeys, including 2 visits to Rome. The first came at the age of 4, when he accompanied his father on a pilgrimage to the Holy City, where legend claims Pope Leo IV anointed the young prince, perhaps presaging his future importance. A second journey to Rome in his youth further exposed Alfred to the wider world beyond the boundaries of Wessex, giving him glimpses of continental culture and the lingering grandeur of Rome that would influence his later vision for his kingdom. Alfred's early education was notable for a time when literacy was rare, even among the nobility. According to his biographer Asser, a Welsh monk who joined Alfred's court in later years, the young prince developed a deep love of Saxon poetry even before he could read. A famous anecdote recounts how Alfred's mother offered a beautifully illustrated book of Saxon poems as a prize to whichever of her sons could memorize it first. Though the youngest, Alfred won the contest, sparking a lifelong passion for learning and literature that would later manifest in his remarkable program of educational reform. As Alfred was growing into manhood, events far to the north were setting in motion forces that would ultimately shape his destiny and the future of England itself. Across the cold waters of the North Sea, the peoples of Scandinavia, Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes, were undergoing their own transformations, embarking on an era of expansion that historians would later call the Viking Age. The Norse homeland was a harsh but beautiful realm of fjords, forests, mountains, and islands, where communities lived in relative isolation from one another and from the rest of Europe. Their settlements clung to coastlines and river valleys where the limited arable land could support farming, supplemented by fishing, hunting, and animal husbandry. Long winters confined families to their longhouses, large timber-framed halls where humans and animals often shared space for warmth, and where the sagas and stories of their gods and ancestors were passed down through the generations. Norse society was organized around the extended family unit and broader kinship networks. At its base was the free farmer or bondi, who owned his own land and weapons, and had the right to speak at the thing, the assembly where legal disputes were settled and important decisions made. Above the bondi stood the jarls, or chieftains, men who had acquired wealth and followers through success in trade, warfare, or both. At the apex of society were the emerging kings, whose power was still often limited and dependent on the support of powerful jarls. The spiritual world of the Norse was populated by a complex pantheon of gods and supernatural beings. The Aesir, led by Odin the All-Father, represented warfare, wisdom, and royal power, while the Vanir embodied fertility, prosperity, and natural forces. These deities were not viewed as perfect or omnipotent, but as powerful beings with their own flaws and limitations, bound ultimately by fate or weird. The Norse cosmos was conceived as a great world tree, Yggdrasil, connecting 9 realms inhabited by various beings, gods, giants, elves, dwarves, and humans. At the root of Yggdrasil lay Hel, where most dead would go, while Odin's chosen warriors, those who fell bravely in battle, would be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla to feast and fight until the coming of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods. This religious worldview profoundly shaped Norse attitudes toward life, death, and honorable conduct. A good death in battle could ensure a place in Valhalla, while the greatest shame was to live without courage or to die the straw death of old age or illness. Reputation or honor was paramount. The only true immortality lay in the stories told about a person after death. This emphasis on reputation and remembrance is captured in the Havamal, a collection of wisdom poetry attributed to Odin. Cattle die, kinsmen die. The self must also die, but glory never dies for the man who is able to achieve it. By the late 8th century, a remarkable technological development had opened new horizons for the Norse peoples, the perfection of the longship. These vessels represented the pinnacle of early medieval shipbuilding, combining speed, maneuverability, shallow draft, and seaworthiness, in a design that would remain essentially unchanged for centuries. Built using the clinker technique, with overlapping wooden planks fastened to a flexible frame, longships could withstand the battering of ocean waves while remaining light enough to be portaged overland when necessary. A large steering oar at the stern provided control, while propulsion came from a combination of rowing and sailing, with a single square sail made of woven wool that could be raised when winds were favorable. The psychological impact of these ships on those who encountered them should not be underestimated. With their high prows often carved into dragon or serpent heads, longships appeared as mythical beasts emerging from the mist, a sight that struck terror into coastal communities throughout Europe. More practically, the technological advantages of these vessels gave the Norse unprecedented mobility and strategic flexibility. They could cross open seas, navigate coastal waters, and penetrate deep inland via rivers and streams. They required no harbor infrastructure, as they could be beached directly on shorelines, allowing for rapid deployment and withdrawal. The causes behind the Viking expansion that began in the late 8th century remain debated by historians. Likely it resulted from a combination of factors: population pressure on limited arable land in Scandinavia, climate fluctuations that made farming more challenging, political consolidation under ambitious kings that displaced rivals, and simple awareness of vulnerable wealth in neighboring lands. Whatever the precise mix of motivations, the result was a sustained period of Norse expansion that would transform Northern Europe and beyond, reaching as far as North America to the west, Russia and Constantinople to the east, and the Mediterranean to the south. The Viking Age is traditionally dated from the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England in June 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this shocking event. In this year, fierce foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria and miserably terrified the people. And a little after that, on the 8th of June, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. This attack on a sacred, undefended site sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Alcuin of York, a leading Anglo-Saxon scholar serving in Charlemagne's court, wrote in anguish, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, the Church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its furnishings, exposed to the plundering of pagans, a place more sacred than any in Britain. Initially, Viking activity in England consisted primarily of swift summer raids targeting coastal monasteries and trading centers, rich, poorly defended sites that could be plundered before local forces mustered a response. The raiders would then return to Scandinavia with their spoils before winter set in. This pattern continued for several decades, with attacks becoming more frequent and penetrating further inland via England's river systems. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms responded with varying degrees of effectiveness, paying tribute, building defenses, occasionally confronting the raiders in battle, but the fundamental threat remained. A significant shift occurred in the 850s when some Viking forces began to overwinter in England rather than returning to Scandinavia, establishing temporary camps on islands or in defensible coastal positions. This development signaled a transition from raiding to potential conquest and settlement. The critical turning point came in 865, with the arrival of what Anglo-Saxon sources called the Great Heathen Army, a large, well-organized Norse force led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Unlike previous raiding parties, this army came with strategic objectives beyond mere plunder. Over the next decade, they systematically conquered 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell first in 867, with the Vikings installing a puppet king. East Anglia followed in 869, with its king, Edmund, executed by the Norse after refusing to renounce his Christian faith, a martyrdom that would make him one of England's most revered saints. By 874, much of Mercia had also succumbed, with its king, Burgred, driven into exile. Throughout these conquered territories, Norse settlers began to establish farms and communities, creating what would later be known as the Danelaw, a region under Scandinavian law and cultural influence. By 871, only Wessex remained as an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom standing against the Viking advance. It was in this year, amid this existential crisis, that Alfred unexpectedly became king. His 3 older brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, had each ruled Wessex in succession, but all died relatively young, the last 2 likely from wounds sustained fighting the Vikings. Alfred himself had already distinguished himself as a military leader, fighting alongside his brother Ethelred at the Battle of Ashdown earlier that year, where the West Saxons secured a rare victory against the Norse invaders. Alfred's accession came at the most perilous moment in Wessex's history. Within weeks of becoming king, he faced the Vikings in battle at Wilton and suffered a defeat, forcing him to negotiate a temporary peace through the payment of Danegeld, tribute money to buy off the invaders. This respite, though humiliating, gave the new king precious time to assess his kingdom's defenses and begin implementing reforms that would prove crucial in the years ahead. The period from 871 to 876 saw relative peace between Wessex and the Vikings, who focused their attention on consolidating control over the conquered northern and eastern territories. Alfred used this time wisely, strengthening his position through diplomatic marriages, alliance building with the remaining independent portion of Mercia, and military reforms. He reorganized the Fyrd, the traditional Anglo-Saxon militia composed of free men obligated to military service, into a more effective force, with half the eligible men serving at any given time, while the others maintained agricultural production. In 876, the uneasy peace broke down when a Viking force under Guthrum, who had established himself as king in East Anglia, moved against Wessex. For 2 years, Alfred engaged in a complex campaign of maneuver and negotiation, sometimes gaining the upper hand, other times forced to retreat. By late 827, the situation had temporarily stabilized, with Guthrum's forces withdrawing to Gloucester after a series of inconclusive engagements. It was against this backdrop that the fateful events of early 878 unfolded, the moment when the burning of Wessex began. In January, during the depth of winter, when military operations normally ceased, Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Chippenham in Wiltshire, where Alfred and his court were celebrating the Christmas season. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this devastating blow with characteristic brevity. In this year, in midwinter after Twelfth Night, the enemy army came stealthily to Chippenham and occupied the land of the West Saxons and settled there, and drove a great part of the people across the sea, and conquered most of the others. And the people submitted to them, except King Alfred. The shock of this winter assault cannot be overstated. The Vikings had violated the traditional seasonal rhythms of warfare, striking when the Anglo-Saxon forces were dispersed and vulnerable. Alfred barely escaped with his life, forced to flee with only a small retinue of loyal followers. For the first time, the survival of Wessex as an independent kingdom hung in the balance, and with it, the future of Anglo-Saxon England itself. The following months represent the nadir of Alfred's fortunes in the period when Wessex quite literally burned. Viking forces fanned out across the kingdom, systematically occupying key settlements, burning those that resisted, and extracting tribute from a population now largely abandoned by their king. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals layers of ash and destruction at numerous sites across Wessex, tangible remnants of the kingdom's darkest hour. Alfred and his small band of followers retreated to the marshlands of Somerset, establishing a precarious base at Athelney, a slightly elevated area amid the wetlands that provided natural protection against Viking pursuit. Here, amid the reeds and mists, the King of Wessex became essentially a guerrilla leader, surviving through a combination of local support, small-scale raiding against Viking outposts, and perhaps some Danegeld that loyal subjects managed to deliver to him. It is from this period that the famous legend of Alfred and the Cakes originates. According to the story, first recorded in the 10th century Life of Saint Neot, Alfred sought shelter in the humble cottage of a swineherd's wife, who, not recognizing the king, asked him to watch her cakes baking by the fire, while she attended to other tasks. Lost in thought about the state of his kingdom, Alfred allowed the cakes to burn, earning a sharp rebuke from the woman when she returned. While historians generally consider this tale apocryphal, it captures something essential about Alfred's situation. A king brought low, humbled by circumstance, forced to confront his failure to protect his people. The psychological impact of witnessing his kingdom burn must have been profound. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle hints at the depth of the crisis when it notes that some of Alfred's subjects fled overseas, while the great majority of those who remained submitted to the Vikings. For a king whose primary duty was to provide protection for his people, this represented the ultimate failure. Yet something in Alfred's character, a combination of religious faith, personal resilience, and strategic vision, allowed him to endure this darkest period without surrendering to despair. Contemporary sources suggest that Alfred used his time in the marshes not just for physical survival, but for spiritual and intellectual renewal. Asser later wrote that the king viewed his misfortunes as divine punishment for earlier pride and inadequate attention to his responsibilities. This period of reflection apparently strengthened Alfred's religious commitment and clarified his understanding of kingship as a sacred trust, ideas that would later inform his ambitious program of reforms. By Easter of 878, Alfred had begun to rebuild his forces, sending messengers throughout the still unoccupied portions of Wessex to summon loyal warriors to his banner. According to later accounts, he even undertook a dangerous personal reconnaissance mission, disguising himself as a harpist to infiltrate Guthrum's camp and gather intelligence on Viking positions and morale. While this story may be legendary rather than historical, it reflects the desperate measures the situation demanded. In May, Alfred finally emerged from the marshes with a reconstituted army, meeting the forces of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire at Egbert Stone near the edge of Selwood Forest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the people received him with great joy, This moment of reunion between the king and his subjects marks the beginning of Wessex's recovery, a turning point in what had seemed an irreversible decline. The decisive confrontation came shortly afterward at the Battle of Edington. Alfred's forces met Guthrum's Viking army in open combat, and after what the chronicle describes as severe fighting, the West Saxons prevailed. The defeated Vikings fled to their fortified camp at Chippenham, where Alfred besieged them for 14 days. Cut off from supplies and reinforcement, Guthrum finally surrendered, agreeing to terms that would permanently alter the relationship between Anglo-Saxons and Norse in England. The terms of this surrender were remarkable for their combination of practical politics and religious symbolism. Guthrum agreed to withdraw from Wessex entirely and to receive Christian baptism, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather at the ceremony, which took place 3 weeks later at Aller, near Athelney. The Viking leader took the baptismal name Athelstan, creating a spiritual kinship with Alfred that supplemented their political agreement. This was followed by a lavish feast at Alfred's royal estate at Wedmore, where the details of the peace were finalized. The Treaty of Wedmore, as this agreement is commonly known, though the actual text of a treaty between Alfred and Guthrum dates from a few years later, established a boundary between Alfred's Kingdom of Wessex and the territories under Viking control, which would come to be known as the Danelaw. This line ran roughly along the old Roman road of Watling Street, following the Thames Valley and then north to the river Lea, effectively dividing England diagonally from southwest to northeast. To the northwest of this line, Guthrum acknowledged Alfred's authority. To the southeast, Alfred recognized Guthrum as ruler. This diplomatic solution reveals Alfred's political acumen. Rather than attempting to expel all Vikings from England, likely an impossible task given the resources available to him, he accepted the reality of Norse settlement in the Eastern Territories while securing his own kingdom against further incursion. By incorporating Guthrum into the Christian community through baptism, he created a religious bond that supplemented their political agreement and potentially gave him moral influence over his former enemy. The burning of Wessex had not been extinguished entirely. Viking raids would continue sporadically in the years that followed, but the immediate existential threat to the kingdom had been averted. Alfred had achieved what had seemed impossible during those dark months in the marshes. He had preserved Wessex's independence and established a foundation for potential future reconquest of the lost Anglo-Saxon territories. The years following the Treaty of Wedmore witnessed one of the most remarkable programs of reform and renewal in medieval European history. Having confronted the near-total collapse of his kingdom, Alfred set about systematically addressing the weaknesses that had made Wessex vulnerable to Viking assault. His approach was comprehensive, touching on military organization, urban planning, legal structures, educational institutions, and cultural renewal. The cornerstone of Alfred's military reforms was the creation of a network of fortified settlements known as burhs across Wessex. Drawing on concepts from Roman urban planning and continental fortification techniques, these burhs were strategically located so that no point in the kingdom was more than a day's march from a defensive stronghold. Each was carefully designed with defensive walls, organized street grids, and provisions for permanent garrisons. A remarkable document from Alfred's reign, known as the Burgel Hidage, details the exact length of wall assigned to each burh and the number of men required to defend it, calculated according to a precise formula. These burhs were not merely military installations but planned urban centers that served administrative, commercial, and religious functions as well. By concentrating population and economic activity within defended perimeters, they fostered urban development while enhancing security. Archaeological excavations at sites like Winchester, Wareham, and Wallingford have revealed the ordered layout of these settlements with regular street grids and standardized plot divisions, suggesting centralized planning. Complementing this defensive network, Alfred reorganized the traditional fire-yard system into a more sustainable and effective force. Rather than calling up all eligible men simultaneously, which would have devastated agricultural production, he established a rotational service where half the force remained available at any given time. He also created a corps of professional warriors, maintained at royal expense, who could respond rapidly to threats while the broader militia mobilized. Perhaps most innovative was Alfred's creation of England's first naval force. Recognizing the Vikings' maritime advantage, he ordered the construction of ships according to his own design, larger and higher-sided than the Norse vessels, though perhaps less maneuverable. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that these ships were dispatched to intercept Viking raiders before they could land, representing a shift from reactive defense to proactive security measures. Military reforms alone could not secure Wessex's future, however. Alfred recognized that the kingdom's institutional weaknesses extended to governance, law, education, and culture, all areas he sought to strengthen through systematic reform. In law, he issued a new code that incorporated elements from biblical sources, earlier Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, and Mercian precedents, creating a more coherent framework for justice throughout his realm. Significantly, this code began with an extended quotation from Exodus, emphasizing the divine origins of law and the king's role as its interpreter and enforcer rather than its creator, a limitation on royal power that reflected Alfred's conception of just kingship. Perhaps most remarkable for a medieval ruler was Alfred's educational program. Having experienced firsthand the shortage of educated administrators, scholars, and clergy in his kingdom, he established a court school and invited learned men from across Britain and continental Europe to teach there. Among these was Asser, a Welsh monk who would later write Alfred's biography, along with scholars from Mercia, Francia, and even more distant regions. Alfred himself participated actively in this educational renewal, learning Latin in his 30s and personally translating important works from Latin into Old English, including Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, St. Augustine's Soliloquies, and the first 50 Psalms. In the preface to his translation of Gregory's work, Alfred articulated a vision of widespread literacy among the free-born men of his kingdom. It seems better to me that we also should translate certain books which are most necessary for all men to know into the language that we can all understand. This educational program was not merely academic but practical and political. By promoting literacy and learning in the vernacular rather than Latin, Alfred made knowledge more accessible and helped forge a stronger sense of Anglo-Saxon identity at a time when it was threatened by Viking incursions. He also ensured the preservation and transmission of key texts that might otherwise have been lost during the turbulent period of Viking invasions. The cultural renewal extended to historical record-keeping as well. It was during Alfred's reign that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was first compiled, an annual record of events written in Old English rather than Latin, providing an invaluable historical source, not just for Alfred's time, but for much of Anglo-Saxon history. While the Chronicle presents a West Saxon perspective and sometimes glosses over uncomfortable realities, it represents an extraordinary effort to preserve historical memory for future generations. Even as Alfred rebuilt and reformed his kingdom internally, he maintained vigilance against the continuing Viking threat. The peace established with Guthrum proved relatively durable, but other Norse forces remained active. In 885, a Viking army that had been raiding on the continent arrived in Kent, besieging Rochester. Alfred responded promptly, relieving the siege and driving the invaders back to their ships. The following year, Alfred's forces occupied London, which had been under Viking control, a significant step in the gradual reconquest of the Danelaw that would be continued by his successors. A renewed Viking offensive in 892-896 tested Alfred's defensive systems to their limits. Two large Norse armies invaded southern England, one landing in Kent, the other in Essex, apparently coordinating with Danish settlers in the Danelaw. For 4 years, these forces maneuvered across southern England, seeking to outflank Alfred's defenses and find vulnerable targets. The effectiveness of the Boers network became apparent during this campaign as the Vikings repeatedly found themselves unable to capture these fortified centers or to engage Alfred's mobile field army on favorable terms. Eventually, frustrated by their lack of success and suffering from supply difficulties, the invaders dispersed, some returning to the continent, others settling in the Danelaw. This successful defense against a major Viking offensive vindicated Alfred's reforms and secured his reputation as not just a survivor, but a victor in the generational struggle against Norse expansion. By the time of his death in 899, at the age of about 50, Alfred had transformed a kingdom that had nearly been extinguished into the strongest, best organized realm in Britain, positioned to expand its influence under his successors. Alfred's legacy extended far beyond his own lifetime, through the achievements of his children and grandchildren, who built upon the foundations he had established. His eldest surviving child, Ethelflaed, married to the ealdorman of Mercia, governed that region after her husband's death as the Lady of the Mercians, constructing additional burhs and actively campaigning against the Vikings in the Midlands. His son and successor, Edward the Elder, continued the reconquest of the Danelaw, while his grandson Ethelstan became the first ruler to be recognized as King of all England, completing the political unification that Alfred had begun. The legacy of the Viking incursions and Alfred's response extended far beyond political boundaries. The period of Norse settlement introduced Scandinavian cultural elements into English society, particularly in the regions of the Danelaw. Place names across northern and eastern England still reflect this Norse influence, with settlements ending in by-village, thorp, outlying farmstead, or thwaite, clearing, signaling their Scandinavian origins. The English language itself absorbed numerous Norse words, including everyday terms like sky, egg, law, husband, window, and knife. Legal practices in the Danelaw incorporated elements of Norse custom, with distinctive features like the division of shires into wapentakes rather than hundreds, and the institution of the lawman, or lagman, as a legal official. Archaeological evidence reveals the gradual blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norse material cultures, with hybrid styles emerging in jewelry, weaponry, and burial practices. DNA studies of modern British populations confirm the genetic contribution of Scandinavian settlers, particularly in regions corresponding to the former Danelaw. This cultural fusion was facilitated by the significant similarities between Anglo-Saxon and Norse societies. Both were Germanic peoples with related languages and similar social structures, making assimilation relatively straightforward compared to interactions with more dissimilar cultures. Religious conversion played a crucial role in this process as Norse settlers gradually adopted Christianity, sometimes maintaining elements of their pagan beliefs within a nominally Christian framework. By the early 10th century, the Viking Age in England had entered a new phase. The descendants of the initial wave of settlers had largely assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society, often converting to Christianity while maintaining distinctive cultural traditions. A period of relative peace ended abruptly in 991, with renewed Viking raids under leaders like Olaf Tryggvason and Sweyn Forkbeard, eventually leading to the conquest of England by Cnut the Great, a Danish king, in 1016. Yet even this second wave of Norse rule would ultimately be absorbed into English identity rather than displacing it. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought yet another layer of complexity to this cultural palimpsest. The Normans themselves were descended from Norse settlers in northern France who had adopted French language and culture while maintaining elements of their Scandinavian heritage. Thus, the French aristocracy that took control of England after Hastings represented, in some sense, a second wave of Norse influence, albeit heavily modified by continental customs and institutions. Looking back across more than a millennium, the burning of Wessex and Alfred's response offer enduring lessons about resilience adaptation, and cultural exchange. What appeared at the time to be the potential end of Anglo-Saxon civilization instead became a catalyst for innovation and renewal. Alfred's darkest hour, hiding in the marshes while his kingdom burned, preceded his greatest achievements and the eventual emergence of a unified English kingdom that would incorporate both Anglo-Saxon and Norse elements into a new synthetic culture. The story also challenges simplistic narratives about victims and aggressors in historical encounters. While the Vikings were indeed fearsome raiders who caused immense suffering, they were also settlers, traders, explorers, and eventually contributors to the cultures they encountered. The Anglo-Saxons themselves had once been invaders, displacing earlier British populations. History rarely divides neatly into heroes and villains, but rather shows us human communities responding to opportunities and pressures in complex ways. For Alfred himself, the burning of Wessex represented both a profound personal crisis and an opportunity for transformation. The king who emerged from the marshes was not the same man who had fled Chippenham in the depth of winter. His experience of near-total defeat appears to have deepened his religious faith, clarified his understanding of kingship as a sacred responsibility, and sharpened his strategic vision. The reforms he implemented were not merely practical responses to immediate threats, but expressions of a coherent philosophy of governance informed by Christian principles and classical learning. Alfred's legacy lives on not just in the historical record, but in the institutions and cultural patterns he helped to shape. His educational program, with its emphasis on vernacular literacy, contributed to the unusually early development of a robust literary tradition in English. His legal reforms influenced the evolution of English common law. His system of burghs laid the groundwork for English urban development. Perhaps most significantly, his successful defense of Wessex ensured that when England eventually emerged as a unified kingdom, it would do so under Anglo-Saxon leadership rather than as a Norse conquest state, preserving essential continuities with the pre-Viking past while incorporating elements of Norse culture. The traditional epithet attached to Alfred alone among English monarchs, the Great, reflects his enduring reputation as a ruler who combined military leadership with intellectual and cultural achievement. Yet perhaps his greatest accomplishment was more fundamental, ensuring the survival of his kingdom and culture at a moment when their very existence hung in the balance. When Alfred watched Wessex burn in those dark months of early 878, he might well have concluded that the end had come for the world he knew. Instead, through a combination of tactical retreat, strategic planning, and bold counterattack, he transformed potential catastrophe into the foundation for a new beginning. As we stand in the 21st century, looking back across more than 1,000 years at these distant events, we might wonder what Alfred would make of the world his struggle helped to shape. His kingdom of Wessex has long since been absorbed into larger entities, yet the language he championed has become global, and many of the institutions he reformed have evolved into modern forms still recognizable today. Perhaps he would see in this continuity, amid change, a validation of his deepest hope, that something essential would survive the burning of his world and emerge, transformed but unbroken, into futures he could scarcely imagine. The Anglo-Saxon poem, The Wanderer, composed around Alfred's time, captures this sense of transformation amid destruction in its most famous lines. Where is the horse gone? Where the rider? Where the giver of treasure? Where are the seats at the feast? Where are the revels in the hall? Alas for the bright cup! Alas for the mailed warrior! Alas for the splendor of the prince! How that time has passed away, dark under the cover of night, as if it had never been. For King Alfred, watching his kingdom burn in the winter of 878, such sentiments must have resonated deeply. Yet the poem continues. Here wealth is fleeting, here friend is fleeting, here man is fleeting, here woman is fleeting. All this earth structure becomes empty. This recognition of impermanence did not lead to despair, but to a deeper appreciation of what endures beyond material destruction: wisdom, courage, justice, and faith. These were the values Alfred embodied in his response to crisis, transforming the burning of Wessex from an ending into a beginning, from catastrophe into opportunity, from defeat into the foundation for a victory that would echo through centuries to come. The embers of Wessex's burning would eventually cool, the ashes would be cleared away, and new structures would rise upon the ruins of the old. Yet something of the fire itself would remain, not as destruction, but as energy, illumination, and transformation in the culture and institutions that emerged from this crucible of conflict. In this way, perhaps, the burning of Wessex never truly ended, but continues to this day in the living legacy of Alfred's response to his darkest hour, a legacy of resilience, renewal, and the enduring capacity of human cultures to transform even their greatest challenges into opportunities for growth and regeneration.